right, hello there, folks. Hi. Hi, Bill. Hi, George. For those of you that don't know me like Bill and George, I'm Ben Spagan. I'm the Vice President of the Jefferson Educational Society, and it's such a delight to be here with you tonight, not just for tonight's event, but for the entire week. So we were so excited last year to be able to embark upon a new journey because we had piloted a weekend residency program. I think one of the valuable things that happens here at the JES is that, we often come into a room and we hear people talk like I'm doing right now from a microphone. But one of the things I really appreciate that our team does is that we don't just use our mouths, we use these and we listen to you all. And one of the recommendations that we had heard following Dr. Robert Garland's Global Summit event was bring him back. And we thought, absolutely, it was a sold-out event. It was a terrific lecture. We've got to bring this person back. But one of the other things that we've heard along the way is, what about an opportunity to create not just one moment, one night, but a series of events to allow an expert, a scholar, to dive into subject matter more deeply and create a longer, deeper, lasting learning opportunity together. And we imagined that as a weekend residency, and we were so honored when Dr. Garland accepted our invitation to say, would you embark upon this journey with us and try something? And last year it was such a grand success, and we were so delighted to have him that we immediately knew we wanted to do what you were all telling us, which was bring him back. So we've brought him back here again for the summer. I've got to ask, just to show of hands, how many went to at least one of the events last summer for the residency with Dr. Garland? So welcome back. I'm so grateful that you're here. If you happen not to raise your hand, we're so glad to have you here tonight for this experience. Of course, we're here to hear about one day in history tonight. But we have 4 more to look at. So it's worthwhile to take a look at those. You don't have to. You're not required to attend all of them. We'd love to see you all week. If you'd love to spend all week with us, I'll be here for all of them. Maybe on Friday we can say who's been to all 5 and how many hands shoot up. And I'd love to see the same number that I saw tonight, maybe even more, because not everybody's hand went up. Before I get into introducing tonight's event, though, I do want to go through a couple of housekeeping notes. One, I'm going to ask you to join me in taking out your mobile devices, and if you've not already, place them in silent mode or airplane mode, or simply turn them off out of courtesy for tonight's presenter as well as your fellow patrons. If you need assistance at any point during the event, don't be shy about raising your hand or coming to find one of our helpful volunteers or team members. We want to make sure you're having the best learning experience that you can have. So if we can help you, we really want to do that. For the Q&A, we're going to have questions from you, the audience. We're going to have volunteers here with microphones. So if you have a question, simply raise your hand. One of our volunteers will come. We ask, do wait, please, to make sure for the microphone, so that way everybody in the room can hear your question. That is your question, not a lengthy statement, not your lecture on a particular thing. There will be plenty of time after the event to talk, but really we're going to try to get through as many questions as we can from you, the audience, for tonight's event. Now, I mentioned 4 more of these are to come. So Tuesday, tomorrow, we'll be back here taking a look. It's something that's always fascinated me, the Ides of March. Then on Wednesday, we're going to look at the gunpowder plot, the Guy Fawkes plot. Thursday, we'll talk about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Then on Friday, we'll talk about the bombing of Hiroshima. Now, what do all of those have in common amongst themselves and in conjunction with tonight's lectures? Well, they're days in history, moments in histories, days that have defined who we are because of what's happened. And then over our course of history, there are days that we can look at the day, if not by hour, but sometimes minute by minute, and wonder how that shaped our humanity. And these are 5 monumental days that have charted the course of where we've headed as a people. What has that meant? What lessons do they teach us about then? What lessons do they teach us about now? And what do we stand to learn from that? And here, I'm so honored to again invite back to the JES stage someone that I'm so delighted to learn from again, Dr. Robert Garland, a professor of history at Colgate University, a man of many accomplishments, but a man many of you are familiar with, and I think by the end of the week, we're going to invite him to just become an Erieite at this point and camp with us every summer. So please join me in issuing a very warm JES Erie, Pennsylvania welcome to Dr. Robert Garland.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry, I think I have to keep away from that. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I am absolutely delighted to be back here. I've had wonderful times here on both the occasions I've come, and getting to know this community and the aims, which I completely endorse, of the JES. It's a privilege to be here, so thank you very much. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the Battle of Salamis. I'm a Greek historian, so I'm speaking from something that I know quite well. In the course of the other lectures I'm giving, I'm not sticking with Greek history. I've an interest in many other periods as well. I'm particularly interested, as Ben was explaining, in things that happen that are defined almost by a single day. Now, we can't always reconstruct what that day consisted in. Sometimes we can, as I shall show. But anyway, something happens particularly at a moment that seems to define the future course of history. And that, I think, is true of what we're going to be talking about tonight, the Battle of Salamis. The Greek world. The Greek world was described by Plato in the dispersal of communities, not just mainland Greece, but also, as you can see, on the Turkish coast there, and also actually over to South Italy and Sicily. Plato said, the Greeks are like frogs sitting around a pond, because they particularly colonized areas close to the sea. They're a maritime people. They were then, they are today. And that is, of course, going to be vital for this particular event in their history. They were a people who recognized certain things in common. They spoke the same language. They worshiped the same gods. And they said, we have the same blood. But in every other imaginable way, they were divided. So there was no general government of Greece or anything remotely like it at the time I'm talking about, which is to say, the great 5th century BC. So I want to set the background to this talk by explaining how very different Greece was from what its great enemy at this time was, which is Persia. Now, when we come to Persia, we're looking at an empire of many different peoples, but united under an autocratic government. That is anathema to the Greeks. The Greeks fiercely defended their independence against not only foreigners, but against one another as well. And you look over that empire there, we don't actually know how many millions of people were under its control, but it was vast, the biggest empire up to that point in history. And Greece there, as you can see on the far left, is just a tiny little dot, as it were. Now, what was the difference? I've explained that Greece was extremely independently minded, whereas Persia was under an autocratic government. The Greeks abhorred autocracy. And the great historian Herodotus, who is our only source for what I'm going to be talking about, has this wonderful story to talk about the Persian king Xerxes. Xerxes, when he was collecting his army to invade Greece, was passing along the road with his millions of men, according to Herodotus, a vast exaggeration as it turns out, but nonetheless, we don't know, but a very large army. And he comes and he gets entertained by a man called Pythias. And Pythias says to him, Xerxes, I have 5 sons. Spare one of them who will look after me in old age. Xerxes is furious. And what he does is divide the sun down the middle, his body, and marches his army through him. That, to Herodotus, explains the difference between the Greeks and the Persians. Xerxes was not a king that you wanted to mess with. So, where did it all begin? It all begins when cities on the Turkish mainland, the west coast of Turkey, in an area that we call Ionia, that orange spot there on the left, these were Greek cities. As I showed in the first slide, the Greeks had colonized the west coast of Turkey. And the Ionians were under Persian control. And in 499, they revolted from Persia, and Athens, plus another city on the island of Euboea called Eretria, sent ships in their support. And what they did was to, having landed, the men marched to Sardis, which you can see there on the right, and they burned it down to the ground. And Sardis was the Lydian capital in that region, and it was under Persian control. And the king of the time, who wasn't Xerxes, the previous king, Darius, he was furious, as you can imagine, and he determined to punish the Eretrians and the Athenians for their behavior. So he sends his fleet, firstly to destroy Eretria, which is on that island there off the coast of Attica, and then as well to destroy Athens. When he lands, it's a very famous story, the Athenians are beached at Marathon, because that's where the Persians land, and they decide, we need help. We can't possibly do this on our own. We need help from the most important other military power in Greece, which is to say, Sparta. So, how do you contact a city that's 150 miles away at speed in the ancient world? You send a runner. Can you imagine? Phidippides, the name of the runner, runs 150 miles to Sparta and says to the Spartans, the Athenians need help. What do the Spartans say? We're awfully sorry, but in fact, we're celebrating a festival to Apollo. We'll come when it's over, but in the meantime, best of luck. So, what does Phidippides do? He has no alternative but to go back to Athens. But then, something extraordinary happens on the way. When he's climbing the mountains, because there's a huge mountain range that he has to go over as well to get from Athens to Sparta, when he's climbing over that mountain range, Taygetos, he's accosted by the god Pan. Pan, in case you don't know, he's a goat god. He has little ears pointed like that. He has a long beard, and he has, at the ends of his legs, he has hoofs. And he says to Phidippides, tell the Athenians that I'm going to help them, but why haven't they given me my own temple? Because if they do, then they will be rewarded. So, do we believe it? I don't know. But wait for what happens. Phidippides runs all the way back to where the Athenian army are now waiting to make war with the Persians. And he says to them, do you want the good news or the bad news? And they say, give us the bad news. And he says, well, the Spartans, they're not going to be any use whatsoever. So what's the good news? Pan is going to fight on our behalf. Yay! Now, something extraordinary happens at this battle. I'm going to get to the Battle of Salamis in a moment, but it's need to give you this sort of introduction to it. Something happens at that battle, which is that there's a much greater Persian force facing a much smaller Athenian force here at Marathon. And so the Athenians, bolstered by the belief that the god Pan is going to help them, what they do, instead of just marching slowly towards the enemy, they run at full speed towards them. Now, they're carrying some 40 pounds of armor on them. So imagine what that is like. And the two armies, when they first encounter each other, are nearly a mile apart. So probably what they do to begin with, they start trotting. But then when they get, say, within a quarter of a mile or something like that, they run full tilt at the Persians. And what happens? The Persians panic. And our word panic comes from the word Pan, that goat god who told Pheidippides that he would fight on their behalf. It was an amazing battle. The Athenians win it. According to tradition, 6,400 Persians are killed and only 192 Athenians. And it's very likely that that figure is in fact accurate. Not necessarily the number of Persian dead. They wouldn't have been too concerned about working that number out. But we do know that 192 bodies were buried in the tumbos, as it's called, at Marathon. That's just the race that he makes from from Marathon to Athens to tell them the news of the victory. I should mention that even after that battle had been fought, the Athenian army immediately marches to the coast because the Persians in their fleet get back on board and they sail all the way around because they're going to try and take Athens from the south. And when they arrive, the Athenian army is already set up there, waiting to fight with them should they dare to disembark. Sad news is that Pheidippides, when he came with the message from Marathon to Athens, died of a heart attack immediately. But he delivered the news. And that is what we celebrate, of course, in the Marathon race, which is 26 miles, the distance of Marathon to Athens. And that's the monument to the Athenian dead at Marathon. It's still a venerated spot. So, we get into the running towards the Battle of Salamis itself. Darius is determined to repay the Athenians for what has happened, but he dies. But in the meantime, the new Persian king, Xerxes, is clearly intent on a much bigger campaign, which is not just to punish the Athenians this time, but to conquer the entire Greek land. In 483 BC, something quite extraordinary happens, which is that the Athenians make a silver strike at a place called Lavrion in southeast Attica. It's in that red spot there on the right. Now, silver is very important because with it you mint coins. It was therefore a great source of wealth to the Athenians. And the question was, what do you do with this? Suddenly, the US is phenomenally wealthy. It wipes off the trillions of dollars of debt. And what does it do with the money? Gives money to Social Security or a general handout or whatever it might be. This was certainly one of the options that was available to the Athenians. Instead, what they did was to put aside all the money that they had now earned from the silver to build a fleet, because they knew that they were facing an existential threat now from the Persian king Xerxes. By the way, a word for the slaves who had to excavate the silver from the mines. This was one of the worst jobs, of course, and they would basically be facing a death sentence once they were conscripted into that kind of labor. Certain forms of slavery in the ancient world were indeed death sentences. Working in the mines, working in the quarries were the worst. Now, the man who decided that they should devote the money from Lavrion to building a fleet was called Themistocles. And he had obviously extraordinary oratorical skills to persuade a people that, listen, don't think about the moment, but think about the future. Because if we don't, there may not be any future. And as the great historian Thucydides tells us, he doesn't tell us about, unfortunately, the wars themselves, but he tells us a little bit briefly about Themistocles. Themistocles was a politician who could have the insight to imagine what was going to happen. And Themistocles made it very clear to the Athenians that they had to make preparation against the inevitable assault from Persia. And what they did with these strike of silver was to build triremes. Now, triremes were the greyhounds of the seas. They were incredibly fast, they were very sleek, and they were very maneuverable. And they were manned by a team of 170 rowers and 30 marines. And these men were very highly trained. Now, we're at the point 483. The Battle of Salamis, which is a great naval battle, will take place merely 3 years later. And in the space of that time, the Athenian people will be trained to become the most formidable naval force in the world. That's an extraordinary achievement by a city-state. And it was not slaves who manned the triremes, it was free citizens. And it was citizens who were poor, because people higher up would have enough to pay for their own army, and they would serve as what were called hoplites, or they might even serve in the cavalry, not that the cavalry was particularly important. So the people who rode in the triremes means a three-banker, and you can see those 3 banks there. They were the poorest citizens in Athens. And there you see on the left a reconstructed ship. It was built just a few years ago, called the Olympias, and it was tested in Greek waters to see how fast it would go. And the stats on that I'll show you here. Important things to realize there: maximum speed of 8 to 10 miles per hour. It could cover 185 miles in a day, and could execute 180-degree turn in 1 minute in an arc 2.5 ships length. So the sailors were very highly trained, and they were in this absolutely state-of-the-art ship, which was unlike anything else that was available to a navy in the ancient world. And at the front of it, it had an iron prow. And the way these battles were fought, of course, was that you would seek to ram your enemy. And one way to ram your enemy and to make it completely unmaneuverable was to go alongside and rip away all the oars. Or to hole it, that is to say, go in broadside, in which case, eventually it would, of course, sink. And then fighting would take place on board between the Marines. But really, it would be the initial hit of the triary, of the opposite ship, that would sink the enemy. So, we can now talk about months. We can't yet talk about days, let alone minutes. Xerxes decides that he is going to invade and conquer the entirety of the Greek mainland. So he collects an army from all over his empire, and he assembles it at Sardis, and then he marches to the Hellespont, the Dardanelles as we call them, which is the division between Asia and Europe. And he has a multi-ethnic, multilingual force, because Persia is a vast empire which, as I said, has conquered many different peoples. And however large this army was, we will never know, but Herodotus tells us it was so large that when the army went by, it would drink rivers dry. Now, we might think that Greece would then suddenly unite and face this existential threat. But no, it didn't. It was only, in fact, a handful of Greek states, important ones nonetheless, some 35 in all, that decided to hold out against Persia. And in fact, more Greeks fought on the side of the Persians during the Persian Wars. Salamis was just one of the battles, but a crucial one, than actually fought on the Greek side. So that tells us much about the disunity among the Greeks. And even among the Greeks that decided to resist Persia, there was crucial disunity as well, because they all had their own individual interests at heart. So Xerxes arrives at the Hellespont, and Herodotus tells us that when he is trying to cross the Hellespont by making a pontoon bridge using ships, as you see there on the right, which is something that is quite feasible to do, there was a storm. And Xerxes, being an arrogant ruler, was so outraged that he sank fiery weights down into the sea and lashed it to show how angry he was and how much more powerful he was than the sea. A wonderful example of hubris, that is to say, arrogant pride, which it's clear Herodotus sees was a reason for the downfall of this whole expedition. But in the end, he crosses the Hellespont, leaving Asia into Europe. What do the Athenians do? Once they hear that Xerxes is on his march south, they decided to consult Delphi. Delphi is the site of the oracle. That is where Apollo, from time to time, resides. And Delphi was a place that you went if you had a particularly important question to ask. It could be a question that you asked personally. Shall I buy this house? Shall I marry so-and-so? Etc., etc. But also states went there to ask critical questions as well. And so the Athenians sent an embassy to Delphi to consult the god. And I put on the side there, April, May, June, July, August, because we don't know exactly when they sent the embassy there. And in fact, Apollo was only in residence 1 day a month. So it was not the case that you could go whenever you felt like it and just ask him a question, because he had other things to do than answer your damn fool questions all the time. So that's what Delphi looks like. I'm sure some of you have been there today. That's on the left, the beautiful little circular temple, but the temple of Apollo over there is on the right, and that is where the oracle was situated. And this was a woman called the Pythia, and we don't exactly know how this all worked. Some people thought that she was high on weed or whatever it might be, and that she therefore kind of got into a state of transfixedness. But anyway, the Greeks believed, oddly, being a very rational, intelligent people, that Apollo would reveal to them signs about the future. And so when they go there, they say, well, what shall we do in the face of this Persian assault? And Apollo says to them, trust in the wooden wall. Now, often what Apollo said, you go away more confused than you were when you arrived. And this was not an obvious answer to give, trust in the wooden wall. So a lot of people thought, well, it must be the wall that is surrounding the Acropolis. That's what the Acropolis looks like today, and it hasn't got a wooden wall around it, but it did in the period we're talking about. So a lot of diehards thought that what Apollo was saying was defend the Acropolis at all costs. In other words, don't abandon Athens. Now, the person I was talking about a moment ago, Themistocles, said no, that's not what the oracle means. The wooden wall is our fleet, because our fleets are made of wood. And what we need to do, there's a corollary to this. What we need to do is to abandon, absolutely, the land of Attica and migrate or evacuate to the island of Salamis and put all our faith in our fleet. Now, this was an enormously difficult decision for people to take because it meant that they had to not only abandon their homes, but also abandon their temples and abandon their graves as well, which were very sacred to them. And they knew that when the Persians came by, what they were going to do was to destroy their temples and their tombs. And this is exactly what they did. Before that, however, or while the Athenians are evacuating and the Persians are making their way south, other military encounters are taking place, most important of which is the Battle of Thermopylae, which lives on in our memory and is often represented, as in the film The 300, which came out a decade or so ago. Thermopylae is in central Greece, where that X is, and it's immortalized as well in the great painting by Jean-Jacques David there, which shows Leonidas and the 300. History, according to Herodotus, tells us that just 300 men stood their ground at Thermopylae against the vast Persian army, and 300 were killed, including King Leonidas himself. In actual fact, that ignores the fact that there were certain other people. There was a force of a people called the Thespians. There were Helots, which were sort of among the Spartan slaves who also fought there. It's seen as a great triumph in some ways of Spartan courage, but ultimately was a defeat, and it did not stop the Persian advance south. And mid to late September, Athens was burnt by Xerxes and his forces. And what did that mean? Well, it meant, among other things, that the Acropolis itself was totally destroyed. The temples on that site were completely destroyed. The sacred olive tree, sacred to the goddess Athena, was also cut down. So we're close now to the Battle of Salamis. And I want you to imagine what it was like for the Athenians at this moment as they have evacuated their entire population to the island of Salamis. And we're at the night before the battle. There's Salamis, as you can see, just off the west coast of Attica there. It's not a very big island at all. And it's just a few miles from the mainland. And they would have been able to see the burning of the Acropolis and the demoralization that the people would have felt at this point must have been considerable, because they were putting their entire faith in their fleet, which, as Themistocles had told them, was what Apollo was actually urging them to do. But they also knew that if the fleet lost the battle, the Persians would round them all up, and as was common practice in the ancient world, all the men would be killed, all the women and children would have been enslaved. And they were going to have a ringside view of the battle which was due to take place. But would that battle take place? And this is where we wish that we had details about precisely what happened this evening just before the battle took place. we're told by Herodotus that Themistocles was aware that the contingent of other Greek fleets that were there and were necessary in order to hold the line were very wary about fighting the next day, and that they were thinking of withdrawing to the Isthmus of Corinth. They weren't interested in protecting Attica, and they could well have said to Themistocles, look, you've lost Attica already, and why should we fight here? Let's go back south to the Peloponnese and defend that piece of land. So, Themistocles, being the man he was, sent a message to Xerxes in which he said, listen, the Greeks are thinking of withdrawing and fighting you another day, but I am on your side, and I suggest that what you do is that you close up the two sides around the island of Salamis and keep watch throughout the night, because the Greek fleet is going to try to make a dash for it and escape to safer waters. And when Xerxes heard that, he thought, that makes perfect sense. And so he ordered his fleet to remain on alert, but very, very quiet. They couldn't make a single sound, waiting for the Greek fleet to try to run for it. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited. Well, imagine how they felt like at 6 in the morning, or indeed at 7 or 8 in the morning, having been awake all night, and they see the Greek fleet now ready to do battle. The men have been sleeping on shore, having a fine old good night's sleep, whereas the Persians are completely exhausted. Now, I've reached the moment, and I can't say anything about it. False advertising, I'm sorry. But what I can tell you is that it was an extraordinary and resounding victory. It is unfortunate, as Peter Green says, that we don't actually have any details. But I ask you to use your imagination to be one of those Athenians, say, watching on shore the best ringside seat that anybody ever had of a battle, I would say, any civilian ever had of a battle in the ancient, medieval, perhaps even modern world, because there would have been thousands of Athenians who were watching the outcome. And they were watching not only the survival of their city, but also their only hope of survival for themselves. I was in Herculaneum in the summer, and I thought of this moment as well, August the 24th, the day that Mount Vesuvius erupted and covered the city in ash. And these people who were hoping against hope that the fleet would come and rescue them, they were on the shore, and there are their bodies. That would have been the fate of the Athenians in Salamis. They would have been completely cut down. So the Athenians win the battle, and it is arguably the battle that changes the course of European history. Afterwards, Themistocles orders, encourages, whatever he did in the Athenian assembly, he says, we're not out of the woods yet. We have to surround our city with a wall. And he gets the entire population, men, women, children, to help build this wall. And he uses the broken monuments. The Persians had indeed destroyed all the graves, and we can see the bases of funeral monuments in that wall. It's a wall that was made in desperate haste, and it surrounded the city and was in place for several hundred years. And again, it was at the foresight of Themistocles that it was built. 8 years later, Themistocles is ostracized. This is a particular process that was in place under Athenian democracy, whereby if anybody became popular, but also with some other person who was absolutely opposed to that person, you would hold this negative vote called an ostracism. And it takes its name from the fact that an ostracon is a small piece of broken pottery, and on it you would write the person that you wanted to have ostracized. And if 6,000 negative votes were cast, then that person would have to go into exile for 10 years. It was a way of avoiding the constant battle between two very prominent politicians. And it was used against Themistocles. And it reminds me of the election in 1945 when Churchill, after having guided Britain through the war, immediately lost the next election. Robert Graves wrote a wonderful poem where he makes fun of the whole event in some ways, suggesting that, in fact, what the Persians would have said, well, no, this was not a really very major, significant event at all. It was one that we just had a minor kind of encounter with the Greeks, but we actually did rather well. And that's all there was really to it. He calls his poem the Persian version. So, what if the Persians had won? Would we be sitting here today? The what if question is one which constantly comes up, and I'll be using it throughout the other lectures to ask the question as well, what if this had not turned out the way it did? And as I said, there was an accidental element to the Battle of Salamis. It could so easily have happened, number one, that the Persians had won the victory, the battle. Number two, that it had not actually been fought. Athens would have been destroyed, and Persia would have gained control of the entire Greek mainland, and the classical era with Pericles, with Socrates, etc., none of that would have happened. So, mainly I think we have to celebrate it, although it was, as I mentioned there, really the beginning of the East-West divide. And that's something, of course, not exactly to be celebrated. One of the achievements of the battle was that the people who had served in the fleet were rewarded by becoming full citizens, and Athenian democracy moved forward to the point where there was complete direct democracy, as we call it, as opposed to representative democracy, which is what we have in this country and in every country in the world today, because populations are too large for people to speak in their own voice. They have to petition from a member of parliament or a representative of some kind. So this was a kind of reward for the people who had fought and saved Athens from destruction. And I like to compare it with the fact that 3 years after the end of the Second World War, when Britain was completely broke, the National Health Service was introduced as a kind of thank you by the government for the privations and sacrifices that the British people had made during the war. One of the things that the Athenians did when they were reconstructing the buildings on the Acropolis was to place these column drums in the walls surrounding it as a kind of memorial to what the Persians had done. The Persians had destroyed their most sacred space, the place where there was a temple to Athena and where other gods and goddesses were worshipped, and where their sacred olive tree was as well. And so it was, lest we forget, that they would always know that they had been threatened and all but destroyed by the Persians, who had committed an act of vandalism at their most sacred spot in Athens. They took an oath after the war not to rebuild the Parthenon. Well, they broke it. And a generation later, under Pericles, actually, the famous statesman, it was decided to rebuild the Parthenon on a far more grand scale than it had been before. And it took about 16 years to build, and it was completed just before the outbreak of the Peloponnesian Wars. And that's what it looks like today. And just to end on a note of controversy, the new Acropolis Museum, which, if you haven't visited it, it's one of the most spectacular museums in the world, was built with not just an intention to house the magnificent sculptures which the Greeks, the Athenians, had actually buried because they'd been destroyed, and they'd buried them on the Acropolis because they were gifts anyway of the gods. So it houses all those finds, but it also makes a direct statement and a plea to the British Museum.